Thanks everyone for joining. I'm delighted to be joined here today by Professor Ken Stanley. Ken is a computer scientist researching artificial intelligence, and he's also the co-author of an awesome book that we really love called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, The Myth of the Objective. And the idea for this talk is to discuss the implications of his book, specifically for education and learning. And so I brought along two of the biggest Kenneth Stanley super nerds that I know, Moritz and Alex, to help me ask some questions during the first sort of moderated part of the talk, which will be around 45 minutes. And then at the end, there'll be an opportunity to ask your own questions if you have them. So yeah, a reminder that this event is being recorded. So if you don't want to have your video recorded or your voice recorded, you can write your questions in the chat and someone else will read them out for you. But yeah, Ken, I'm really delighted to have you here. And I guess we can maybe kick this off by sort of framing the discussion today. Could you sort of introduce your argument against objectives and how it relates to the education system specifically?
Yeah, the book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, it has a kind of a history in artificial intelligence because I am an artificial intelligence researcher and machine learning researcher. And we were looking at algorithms and doing experiments that were showing this, what I thought was like a really kind of mind-blowing insight, which is that sometimes setting an objective actually makes it less likely that you'll achieve it. Or to actually broaden that point, setting an objective can actually make it less likely that you achieve anything interesting at all. Because you become sort of single-mindedly focused on a metric that's with respect to the objective. And that metric can be deceptive. And so basically what it means is you can miss all the stepping stones that could lead to other places, which would be really great to have. It might actually get you to where you'd want to go, but also to other places that you didn't even realize you could go because you're so myopically focused. And we were seeing results that showed this phenomenon in AI experiments, including experiments with people in the loop. Like one of them was called PickReader. And so we saw this like really counterintuitive phenomenon where you would see that like people couldn't get to things if they were trying, but they could if they weren't trying, or they could find really interesting stuff if they weren't trying to find anything in particular. And that principle at first sort of observed in AI, like it led to like a new algorithm, which is called the novelty search algorithm or novelty search. It led to a lot of kind of ideas in artificial intelligence, including also like quality diversity algorithms, which is like a whole field now. And it was kind of controversial there. So I got to talk to a lot of people about it because people were interested in what are the implications of this. If you think about it, it goes a little bit against the usual grain of what happens in machine learning, where usually you think of it as we have an objective function and then we measure progress with respect to the objective. And actually to help with intuition, just like why would that not work in general? If you think about it, if you have a complex problem, then the stepping stones that lead you to where you hope to go won't look like the solution or the objective. And if you think about it, it's like the definition of complex, you know, that's almost like a truism. Like if the stepping stones actually resembled where you want to go, then it's not a complex problem, or it's not a hard problem. It's actually easy, so you have no problem. But we're interested in problems that are hard. So in those, it's by definition almost that the stepping stones won't resemble where you want to go. Well, if the stepping stones don't resemble where you want to go, that means that your metrics will lead you astray, because metrics usually are about how are you doing with respect to where you want to go. So it's saying like, do you increasingly resemble where you want to go, which usually would be some kind of score. And that score would go up as you get closer. But the thing is, the stepping stones don't resemble the objective, and therefore, like it's deceptive to actually follow that score up the gradient. Or if you want to think about it, minimizing loss would be deceptive to follow it down. This insight at first, like it was interesting in machine learning discussions, but then it was kind of obvious that actually this is interesting to discuss outside of machine learning, and including by machine learning researchers who I was talking to, because they would be like, well, wait a second, like, what does this mean for me? Like, if I'm pursuing objectives, or like, what does it mean for my department or my school, or maybe like society at large, or every institution on earth? And it's sort of like, you know, our culture is completely saturated in objective driven types of pursuits. Like if you're in Silicon Valley, you're like stuck with OKRs all over the place. But, you know, if you're in research, like you have to declare when you're applying for funding, you have to declare your objective, and then sort of say like, how are you going to reach it? And then if you can't like make that clear, then you probably won't get any money. And it's just all over the place. And like every industry, this is absolutely ubiquitous. And so I started to talk to some groups outside of computer science after a while. Like somebody saw me speak at a computer science conference and invited me, for example, to speak to some artists. And I started to realize that this insight, which I started to call the objective paradox, it's like having an objective can actually stop you from reaching your objectives, is like really important to people, and actually resonates at a deeper level. Like I found that it was cathartic to have these discussions for some people, because like with the artists, they were saying like, look, I can't justify what I'm doing to my parents. I can't justify it to my teachers. Like, how am I going to make money? Like nobody understands why I'm doing this. But the thing that I'm saying basically says, well, actually, sometimes it's better not to have an explicit objective. And the alternative is basically to follow what's interesting. And what is interesting is individual and it's subjective. So it makes everybody uncomfortable because we want to be totally objective about everything. But the thing is that we have a very good nose as humans for the interesting. And it depends on your background in your field. What's interesting to you is different than what's interesting to me. But we're afraid of this idea of following the interesting, but it is the alternative, because what it does is it reveals all the stepping stones. Things that could be interesting are stepping stones to other things. We don't know to what, but they do lead to interesting things. And we're generally, as a society and as individuals, very afraid of following the scent of interestingness. And so, one part of so we ended up writing a whole book about this. Myself and my co-author, Joe Lehman, who was a PhD student at the time of mine. We wrote this whole book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, because we kind of felt that this is a really unusual conversation. Like nobody's talking about this, but it's like, to me, it seems like a pathological aspect of society. It's kind of interesting because it's not even controversial. Like most things that are problems are at least controversial. Somebody is on one side, somebody's on the other side. With objectives, there's no dissent. Like there's no other side to it. Like everybody pretty much is bought into this. It's just like total dogma. And so like we thought like this is at least a conversation we should have, if not something that we should change. Like let's start talking to people about this. And we sort of realized that like you can't do that through computer science conferences. Like this is a society-wide cultural issue. So let's try to write a book. And that's why we wrote this book, is about all the gamut of things that all the implications that this has for society. And one of those, which is I think something that I like to have an opportunity to talk about, because I think it's gotten some of the least attention, is education. There is a chapter in the book on education. And, it's really interesting because I've had the opportunity, because of this book, to talk to people in so many different fields. And I guess you could say even different walks of life, because it sort of applies to almost anything that you do. And so I've been invited to many different communities that are like way outside what normally like someone in AI or something would be talking to. But one I haven't really is education. I don't really know what it is. There's something about, like, I really strongly felt this has huge implications for education. I'll tell you in 1 second why I think that, but I thought these implications were really big, and I was really excited, like that this would probably stimulate some discussion there, of the way that we both measure individuals and institutions like schools, like how we decide if they're performing well, how we decide where funding should go, how we decide what should be continued, what should not be continued, like all the gatekeeping that happens, like it's all in question, I think, because it's also objectively driven. And but somehow it seems like the whole like the whole system around education is more impervious somehow to this kind of criticism than other kinds of areas. I found like very open to like, let's talk about this. This is important. Like, this is really like, this is how we do business, but maybe we should change. But education, I've had no bites at all. And so to be a little more specific though, in education, what the critique is, like there's basically two. There's both the individual level and, like I said, the institutional level. But I think it's best to start at the institutional level, because there I think there's kind of a fiasco, which is that, like, at least in the US, and I know this may be more international audience, but in the US, it's probably similar around the world. Like, we have a very objective way of deciding whether institutions are performing well. And it's based on testing, like standardized testing. And of course, this is appealing for the same reason, by the way, that objectives are appealing across the entire culture, because we're all very scared that we might do something that doesn't work. And so by being very strict and rigid and having this assessment-based culture, we make ourselves feel like nothing's going to go wrong. Everything is being rigidly measured and strictly patrolled so that nobody gets to do anything bad or walks outside the lines. And so like what happens though is that we look at it as at an institutional level, which is like basically saying that how is this whole school doing with respect to the standardized testing, which we periodically do, because presumably, and it's very objective, like what we hope will happen across the entire nation, probably the entire world, is that like everybody will start to get 100 on every test. That's like progress with an objective type of heuristic. So like we're hoping that, you know, like there's a lot of underperformers this year, but next year there'll be fewer, and the next year there'll be fewer. And I mean, it's not said explicitly, but I guess like the end goal is that everybody will get 100 eventually, like 10 years from now. Of course, this never works. Like the education system is always in crisis. And, you know, the way that we address it is by trying to revise those standardized tests. Like nobody questions in the first place, or they are questioning actually. Of course, people do question the whole system. Like some people don't like it. Basically, the general principle that the standardized tests basically just don't actually have anything to do with what we need to do if our goal is to actually improve the education system, which is very counterintuitive. It's like the testing actually can stop you from knowing whether you're getting towards an actual really high level of performance. That's just totally counterintuitive. But if you think about it, it's just the objective paradox restated, just with respect to education. It's like having an objective can stop you from actually achieving your objective. This is especially true in complex spaces and very ambitious problems. And I would assert that like actually trying to get like the entire country to get 100 on every test is an extremely ambitious problem. And like with totally unknown solutions. It's very complex, like how we might do that, because every, you know, particular like situation in every different school across like an entire country or the entire world is unique. And so like it's very hard to like actually say anything general that can like make all of this work all in lockstep together. And yet we're following this objective paradox as if like it actually will work. And so what I think is the alternative, which I haven't like focused on in this little preliminary explanation, is like when I say following interestingness, what it means when you talk about education is that what we really need is a divergent system of search. Like there's a need for creativity. Like if you have like people in like, say, a disadvantaged area who are like not doing well in something, like the way to deal with that is unknown. We need creativity. Like there are different methods, but we need to try different things. When we find something interesting, that can percolate through the system. And by the system, I mean basically like a social network, like it can percolate through the social network. And then that can basically transfer out, and we can see, does it actually transfer, or maybe it doesn't transfer. Like the point of open-ended systems, and basically the alternative to the objective paradox, is this kind of divergent search. And it means that like you're branching out, we're trying new things. And so the education system needs to work that way if we want to actually get out of whatever the local optimum that we're in right now is. And this is frightening, of course, because it sounds like there's no oversight. And this is like the thing we all love. And we want that security blanket. We want to control everybody down to the last teacher. Like everybody has to be following the system, the standardized tests, ensure that. But the thing to understand is that following interestingness does not imply you can't have any oversight at all. It just implies an entirely different system, a system which is more like a peer review style system than like a top-down, overall, globally controlled system. You can still have people look at what other people are doing, and that's actually helpful, because that's how ideas spread through a divergent network, is that people will see each other's ideas. But if somebody's doing something insane, yeah, of course we have to do something about it, and that will get noted if like all the people who see that like say, wait a second, there's a problem going on over there. This is really too crazy for us. And I kind of call that a minimal criterion. Like it's okay in a divergent process or an open-ended process to have a minimal criterion, which is like nobody can get away with going below something. But we don't have to constantly be following a gradient up. Like that is the objective paradox. And we can forget about that because it doesn't even work. What we need is to actually cause creativity to blossom. And this kind of minimal criterion driven search is actually how evolution works. If you think about it, like everybody has to be able to have a baby basically walking around as a human Xerox machine, or like a living Xerox machine, in effect, in order for that lineage to continue. That's a very high minimal criterion. But as long as you actually do that, it doesn't matter, and nothing else matters as long as you are that Xerox machine that makes a copy. And so it's okay to have minimums. but like the problem is we're climbing gradients to a maximum, which is impossible and won't work in this kind of space. I can apply a similar critique at the individual level, but I should pause because I don't want to just make a big speech.
No,
And
that
then
was
answer
great. No,
the question.
it kind of feels like you've had this bottled up almost. Like you mentioned while you're talking that uh, the implications of your book for education and learning has been something that hasn't really been explored very much by the people interviewing you and so on. And it's kind of
Yeah.
surprising to me because everyone spends so long in education nowadays, like multiple decades of their lives are spent in education. It's probably one of the biggest areas in which we systematically divert from non-objective search and collecting stepping stones and everything like that. Yeah, I'm curious, like what kinds of feedback you've got from students, parents, teachers, people in the education system who have skin in the game. You know, what are they saying to you in response to your book? You mentioned that the idea of non-objective search, it is intuitive, but I'm curious to like how parents and people like that respond. Like, do they find it to be similarly intuitive, or do they find it to be kind of like, oh my God, I'm going to send my kid to just do whatever he wants, and that's really risky and uncertain compared to the education system, which has this kind of safety blanket effect?
Yeah, so I think like generally if I talk to like I've found generally anybody responds positively. I'd say like 95% of people who I talk to about these ideas, just in general, not just about education, respond very positively to them, which actually a surprise to me because I thought it'd be super controversial. I'm basically saying we should get rid of objectives for really ambitious stuff. I never said that we should get rid of them for everything. Like if you want to lose weight, like, you can go on a diet, like you get exercise, like that's reasonable kind of objective stuff. Talking about ambitious stuff, like overhauling the entire education system or curing cancer or something like that. But so people generally agree and really take delight in it. I found like people really, and so it was interesting to see that even people inside of systems that work that way, who I think would think are sort of the gatekeepers, they don't even like what they themselves are doing. And they kind of find kind of a level of disgust with like the way the system works. But people generally feel kind of entrapped in a system. So they're like, I don't want to do things this way, but I answer to people who basically expect things to work this way. And it's very hard to disentangle all of that. There's very few people who aren't answering to anybody at some level. And so, ultimately somebody answers to shareholders or CEOs or the government, or there's something there. And so it becomes hard to change things, but people generally agree. So like, that means that generally they would agree as individuals with the educational critique, so like parents, like a lot of people in all kinds of fields are parents, like they would generally agree and even allude to their children that like they're doing things a little more non-objectively, like they're not forcing their kids to go down a certain path and so forth. But what I don't really have is like actual people in the education system itself telling me anything. I haven't heard from them. I haven't, like I've heard from parents, of course, students. Yeah. Like students really like this, we all know that like life is stifling in the education system. Like it's not really fun in the education system up until, maybe you get to the PhD level. Like for me, the first time I think anybody really seemed to want me to do what I thought was interesting was probably around PhD. Like they'd actually encourage you to think of your own interests. Like that seemed like, kind of like mind-boggling. Like they actually care about what I can't find interesting. Like they tell me what to do. I never decide what to do. And so like students recognize this, I think, and generally love it. Like they resonate very well. People know intuitively that like something is wrong, that like we're not really allowed to follow our interests, and like that muscle is therefore withering on the bone. Like that's something that like was really good when you were like a toddler. Like you could follow your curiosity with no objective like every day of your life, and somehow this is being destroyed over the course of childhood by the education system. So people do recognize that and seem to feel really good and liberated by the message that actually there's a principled argument for why you should continue to do that, and the system is working against it. But what I don't have, and I haven't heard, is from people in the system itself. Like they haven't, I mean, and I'm not saying that they're obligated to do this, but I've never been invited to an education conference. I've never gone to a teacher conference. I've heard basically nothing from people in educational administration, teachers, like it just silence. And I tried a little, I like sent an email, but that's really weird, by the way. Like I usually don't try to force myself onto a community. Like if they come to me, like that's natural and organic and I'm really happy, but they're like to actually like just cold email someone and just be like, you might find this book interesting. It's totally embarrassing and it's weird. It's like if people don't want to read the book, they don't want to read the book. I tried it a little because I was like, I really, really wish they knew. Maybe people just don't know about this book. And I felt like this is a weapon for the educators because I figured they probably are sick of the whole thing. I don't think that teachers like doing the standardized testing stuff and having their total autonomy ripped away from them. Like it just seems, I'm sure it's stifling and they don't like it, but I just haven't had the conversation. And the people I really want to talk to are the administrators who try to run this ridiculous system. The teachers, I imagine, would feel good about this. But it's the people who construct the system. And it's of course other people critique it from other directions. People obviously don't like standardized testing. There's people who don't like that. But what I think I'm offering is a better way to attack that, because it's not just coming from the fact we don't like standardized testing. It's a principled argument going all the way back to optimization and like why it doesn't work when you have really ambitious objectives. And that's, I think, a really difficult thing for like people who are answering to the system to explain, because they don't know these principles. They don't understand that like this is actually extremely naive from the perspective of how search works, to think that you're going to fix an entire complex system in this very naive, like basically destined to land on a local optimum, naive hill climbing almost that we're doing to the entire system. And so that's the thing I'm missing. I haven't had that conversation. I wish I could have the conversation because I think it would give them a weapon. I imagine a lot of people would like this weapon, including all these critics. Like they don't like the system, but they don't know about this argument. And I wish they did, because like if they knew about the argument, I think it would make it much more principled and much more sharp.
I think so you basically mentioned that there's two angles at which you can sort of make the criticism against the education system. There's the institutional level at which we abuse objectives essentially, and also at the individual level. I think in the conversations I've had in like the SuperMemo wiki community with a lot of people in there, a lot of people feel really disillusioned with attempts to change the education system at the institutional level, because at each level you basically have like this pyramid of administrators on top of you, each one of whom can just say no, you can't do that, you can't change the system. Any sort of variation to them is kind of going downhill, or it's not worthwhile because it doesn't look good by the metrics and the measurements that they use. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of sort of wiggle room and potential to apply these kind of principles in your book to individuals, because anyone like students or just free learners or anyone who just wants to learn something can apply these things to their own life. So I'm curious to know like advice for people in the education system who've read your book, they feel inspired. What can they do to sort of apply the principles to their life, working within the constraints of the education system?
Okay, yeah. So in the education, people in the education system. So do you mean students or teachers? You say that?
Students, yeah.
Students. Yeah, yeah. So it is a shame that that the administrative system is so tangled up that it does seem impossible. Like I just can't accept this. There's got to be a way to do. Obviously, there needs to be a revolution, sort of, because of the fact that it's so entrenched that it's just like impossible, like for anybody at any level to do anything. But still, I don't think we should give up on that. But to turn to the individuals, actually, one interesting story. Like I did have this one experience which I thought was interesting, where I gave an interview on like a public radio, local public radio in New Mexico. And some grandmother heard me talking about this, just the general non-objective stuff on the radio, and somehow found my office number, like got in touch with me and cold called me and basically told me that her grandson, who was 14 years old, was too objective in his life. And it's like partly that he's getting it from the education system. Like he's really worried about all these objectives. And she said, can you talk to him and like help him not be this way anymore? And I mean, this is really, really weird for me. I mean, I'm, a computer scientist. I don't usually do like sessions one-on-one to help somebody. But I agreed to this because I thought it was super interesting. So she came with her grandson to meet me. And we had, I explained everything in the book and kind of tried to show him that he doesn't need to think that way. And I think it's sort of representative, of what students are facing. Like when we talk about like how we feel within the education system, is we do get really, really objectively obsessed because the system is training us to be that way. And this just the incentives make it force us to be that way. It's like not anyone's fault, because like you're going to fail in school. It's going to have bad effects on your whole life. So like, it's not like you're crazy to care about this. But so like, this is one of the problems, like in giving this kind of advice, is that like, you can't really just buck the system entirely, or else you're taking huge risks. Now, I do think some people get away with it. Somebody like Steve Jobs, who, by the way, I don't think he screwed up in high school. I don't actually know, but I know in college he dropped out. Like you get to that point, like that is kind of risky. I wouldn't necessarily advise it, but like some people do have a very strong view of what's interesting. Like Steve Jobs is interesting because I guess he thought calligraphy was interesting. He sat in on calligraphy classes, as I understand it, after dropping out, because it didn't matter anymore what classes he was attending. And like, that's like really being confident in your instinct for the interesting, like, because it's true, like for most people, I think, what possible use is it to be learning about calligraphy when you basically just flushed your education down the toilet? But that's what I call like real dedication to the non-objective principle. I mean, the guy just had an instinct. And I think that to some extent, like, I wouldn't necessarily advise to go that far. But actually, one thing you should keep in mind is that like the trade-off that you're dealing with here is the trade-off between objectives and risk. Like the less objective you are, the more risk you have in some sense, because you don't have a security blanket and you don't know where you're going. And so of course you're accepting risk if you don't have clear objectives. The problem is, if you do have clear objectives, if they're really ambitious, they're not going to help you anyway. But if they're not ambitious, they might help you. It's just that you'll achieve something that's not ambitious. And the education system is constructed that way. So there's a lot of things that the education system will deliver to you, as long as you're diligent, that are reasonable and modest. And like, you can get to certain points, like you can become an accountant. And it's not because I'm trying to criticize accountants. It's just that I'm saying that like many people have achieved that. It's not anything that's like extraordinary. It's not like curing cancer. It's like, we know there's a path to get to accounting and to become an accountant, and we know what the steps are. And so if you're diligent and follow that objectively, like, you'll probably succeed. And so like the trade-off here is that if you don't want to just do these modest kinds of things, and by modest, I don't mean bad, I just mean things that we know are just achievable by like reasonably diligent people, and you just want to do something extraordinary, then you're going to be taking risks. This is obvious, but it's something that you have to understand, is like when you get non-objective, you're talking about assuming risk on purpose. Now, like a smart person, I think will mix. Well, they won't have all their eggs in one basket. So they'll be doing some things to protect themselves, which are just basically objectively driven, especially in school, like passing their classes. But they'll also have some things that are not objectively driven, which are basically just following passions and interests and doubling down on things that nobody knows where it's going to lead. And that, I think, is like a reasonable piece of advice. Like, you should be able to do that. And I think school does kind of inhibit that like that, which is not crazy. Like I mean, that attitude is not crazy, but it is crazy to inhibit it, because this is healthy. And I think school even inhibits that, because like, you get to high school and you're just like saturated with all these clubs and activities. It's like all laid out for you objectively, all the things you can achieve, that you can't just like follow an interest. It's dangerous, like for applying for college and all these, like every minute of your time should be accounted in a way that the assessment culture will eventually approve and say, oh, good job, that's amazing. You got like this rating, and you're a great debater, you're on the debate team, and you like ran well in track, and you volunteered at the nursing home and all this stuff. Like, these are things that are laid out before you objectively that you can do. So like, to actually make time to follow an interest, it doesn't mean like you spend 5 minutes a day on a hobby. Like, I think like the non-objective thing for an individual, you have to really be serious. Like, you're going to follow something because it's interesting to the bitter end. And that's like the way you get to interesting things. And the bitter end could be bitter. Like, it might not work because you don't know where it's going. But the thing is that it's people who are following paths that they don't know where they're going that eventually sometimes get to amazing things. So that's how amazing things happen. And the problem is that I think the education system could allow some degree of this. Like I accept and actually even agree that the education system needs some degree of objectivity, because like there are some basics that absolutely do need to be locked in, like along the road to maturity. But I think that we could also give people some more latitude to follow what they think is interesting. And we see, I think, that people oftentimes like don't necessarily have a well-rounded record across like all the disciplines, like the straight A student type of person, like all the AP tests, like in America, the AP is like the AP is the advanced placement testing. Like we see people who aren't like that, who have a lot of like doing pretty mediocre in some areas, but like somehow they just got obsessed with this one area, like went down that path way far down, more than like a normal person would. And it turned out to make like an incredible career. And now they're famous and rich, or whatever it is that you care about. And like they've had a huge impact on the world. And this story happens over and over and over again. You know, if you look at people who are like wildly successful, it's like they let some things kind of wither on the vine, and just went down, like doubled down on the thing they found really interesting. And the problem is that we don't create a situation where people can do that with the degree of protection, so that if it doesn't work out, like they're not ruined, because the education system is sort of about ruining you if you don't follow the objective principle, like whole cloth through every possible discipline. And so there's a reasonable compromise I think an individual can find. But I think like the message that I would want to send overall is that you have a right, and it's actually principled, if you do decide that you're going to follow some of your interests pretty hardcore in your life, but protect yourself, like do some of the things you need to do. But this is a reasonable thing to do. It's not like crazy, it's principled, because I'm saying like we've written a whole book, we've done research, we have results that show following your interest is a principled thing to do if you want to accomplish something extraordinary. It won't work out, maybe even most of the time, but if you keep doing it and you don't put all your eggs in one basket, only people who do that will be the ones who do something extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Kenneth, first of all, big fan of your work. And I have a somewhat related question on curiosity, where I'm curious, you touched on sort of the topic on multiple sides, but I'm curious, like thinking very sort of first principles, what is it? Is it potentially an instinct, or is it even, does this instinct have a objective as it's on its own? And yeah, I'm curious if you have thought about this and what role curiosity plays in this non-objective driven search process.
Yeah. Well, curiosity, I think, is very close to what I'm calling interestingness. It's an instinct for what's interesting. I guess you might say it's also accompanied with curiosity, with a drive to pursue it, I suppose, because if you're not curious, you might think something's interesting, but not be willing to actually pursue it. So sort of you're driven and actually have a very kind of keen instinct for what's interesting. And so I think like it's essential, like it cannot, like if you're trying to actually follow this kind of like open-ended principle of search, like you're saying, like I'm going to actually follow paths that may lead to things that I don't know yet, but that could be extraordinary. You like basically have to be curious, because you need the drive to actually get the motivation to do it. And you need to have a sense of what's interesting. So the problem, the word interesting is ill-defined. And this is why often people will just want to turn away from this kind of advice, because everybody wants a really like detailed definition so we can get objective again and we'll feel comfortable. Let's get a definition, then we can have a metric, then you can tell me whether what you're doing is really interesting. We're back to feeling comfortable but going nowhere. Because the thing about it is subjective. But the thing about it is that like human beings, one of the greatest talents we have is that we have this subjective instinct for the interestingness. This is what's absolutely amazing about us. I think when it comes to human intelligence, this is what AI still doesn't have. It doesn't understand subjective interesting. It starts to, AI over time is like basically like taking away all these advantages that we have. But that's one of the last ones to go, I think, is this nose for the interesting, because it's basically an understanding about the future and not the past. Like we can learn how to do things that have already been done. And AI can learn those things too by just watching and observing the data of how they've been done. But interestingness is about what hasn't been done yet and what isn't known yet. And there's not data on it yet is the problem. But we have a very keen talent about this. And so like in order to create the future, like to uncover the paths that are going to lead to things that are extraordinary in the future, we have to follow paths of interestingness, and therefore we have to be curious.
Yeah, I think there's actually a few sort of this like models of curiosity and attempts to somehow model it. One I like is that it reduces sort of the discrepancies in our heads of existing theories, where we try to explore. I think David Deutsch also has to some extent that idea. We try to explore paths where it reduces this discrepancy or the problems basically in our head between theories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you would try to model it somehow mathematically or like programming curiosity, do you have any like mental model of how this process works?
That's true, and you're right. People have tried to model it and continue to try to model it, and it's a topic in artificial intelligence. People even would use the term curiosity sometimes, but you hear other terms like intrinsic motivation. But basically, they're about that kind of a thing. And so, yeah, especially in the field of AI, it's in everybody's interest to figure out how to model curiosity, because we understand that exploration is important. So what are the kind of elements that go into that? Well, one that's clear, I think, is novelty. It's one thing that's true, I think you could say sort of blanket as true all the time, is that everything that's interesting is novel. However, the converse is not true. So it's not true that everything that's novel is interesting. You know, there are novel things that aren't interesting, just crazy, like useless, like wouldn't interest anybody. But the thing is, like, that everything that is interesting is novel is pretty much true. You know, there are lots of amazing ideas, like cars, for example, but they're not interesting right now because they're not novel. At some time they were novel, and then they were interesting. And so it's always going to be accompanied with novelty. And so I think the first proxy is novelty and the ability to detect it. It's not sufficient, like I said, because novelty alone doesn't tell you something's interesting, but it's necessary. And so like that, there's a lot of work. And like I said, like one of the first things that came out of our insights about the objective paradox was this novelty search algorithm. So it's named after novelty, and it was basically saying, like, we're just going to look for novelty as a proxy for interestingness. We recognized that, like, it's not as good as interestingness. If I could formalize interestingness, this would be an incredibly powerful algorithm. But this, again, especially what we're talking about, it's very hard to formalize. But novelty is at least a proxy, and it can do some interesting things. And so, like, but the thing is, even in novelty, you have to understand that it's also not completely defined. Just by saying novelty, it's not a fully defined concept, because, you know, what makes something novel? We have to get into that. And it's actually domain specific, and we can argue about it. You know, like, I mean, we used to be interested, like in AI, like we were interested in, like, one of our sort of toy domains for novelty was robots walking through mazes. Because one of the points we wanted to make was that if you just try to find novel paths through the maze, then you'll eventually figure out how to get out of the maze. And you don't even have to know what the objective is. You'll eventually get out. So this is sort of like an allegorical point, like it makes the point in a microcosm. But the thing is, then you have to then say, well, what does it mean to have a novel path? Like, is it every point along the trajectory we should look at, and then we should compare paths point by point? Or is it like just the final point? Like, then we could say, like, just where you ended up, and then it's like novel compared to ending up in some other place. And like, the answer is that there is no right answer to this. It just depends what you're interested in. And this gets back to what's interesting again. So it shows that basically this is a very complex problem, because even in discussing novelty now, we have to get back to sort of saying, well, what are we interested in? Like, one thing is clear, I think, like if you talk about robots and mazes, like I made this point that, like, if you had a light that was like attached to the head of the robot, or the top of the robot, say it's like a wheeled robot or something, and it can blink, basically, the robot can decide when to blink the light. If we define novelty as the blinking pattern of the light, clearly this will not help us learn about interesting places to go, because it's completely orthogonal. It has nothing to do with what we're interested in. So what we're interested in actually affects what we think are actually like the dimensions of interest within the novelty space itself. And we're going in circles now, because now we're saying novelty is defined in terms of interestingness. But really what it gets to, I think, is that we can begin to assemble the components of interestingness, but it's domain specific. And we have to grapple ultimately with the idea that, like, a little bit of this is subjective ultimately, because it is domain specific. So, like, I have to sort of like enter into the conversation that I care where the robot goes. Like, that is just my own interest. And it's not worth having a giant philosophical discussion about why. Like you could try to push me on this and say, but why do you care where the robot goes? We need to be objective about this. It can't be that you're just interested in where it goes. There's got to be a reason. Like, is it that like it's going to go somewhere important because we care where it goes? Like this is getting like kind of pedantic and ridiculous if we start discussing it at that level, because ultimately everything we do is motivated subjectively. Like why are we even pursuing AI at all? It's just because we find it interesting. We can argue it's going to be useful, but useful for things that we're interested in doing and so forth. And so like, I think at some level we have to accept that this will ground out in something subjective. And we're just going to be writing down, if we're talking about formalization, what we subjectively find interesting at the end of the day, which is not universal. Like we all have different opinions about what's interesting, and that's healthy and good because that's going to help us diverge and explore the space of what's possible. And so like an individual will, if they're trying to formalize it differently from another individual, if we be honest about this. And that's totally fine. We're going to have to grapple with that if we really want to formalize it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, subjectivity will come into it.
Interesting.
Then, hello, I have another question which is related to this instinct for the interesting. And you basically propose replacing objective-based searching with humans' natural senses for detecting interestingness and potential. And for example, you say that all of us have an uncanny instinct for sniffing potential. But referring to these abilities as instincts may be taken to mean that they are inborn and also fixed. But are they inborn and fixed? So can we, through learning, become better at sensing potential and better at judging what is interesting? And in the opposite direction, can we become worse at it? And now to connect it back to education, in there, students often don't search for information themselves, but they are supplied information they must study by others. And so they don't really rely on these instincts to find the stepping stones themselves. And do you think that this could possibly lead to losing some of those abilities because of disuse?
Well, great questions. Like on the first point about can you get better at searching for interestingness? I think absolutely. Like it's your what you think is interesting is a function of your lifetime of experience. And so like one thing to understand here though is that again, it doesn't ground out anything objective because like there's no ground truth about what's interesting. Like there's nothing to ultimately decide, or there's no arbiter that says like you're wrong or you're right about it. But what does happen, what I think happens is that as you gain expertise in something, especially if you did go far down a path, like if you were researching AI like I was, you'll start having an instinct for some of the real nuances, you know, some of the fine-grained points that like other people won't see at all. And this will influence what you find to be interesting. And this is why, like when we invest in educating people for many years, like PhDs, it could be almost 30 years or something. Like we should let them tell us what they think is interesting. Like the fact that we like basically cage all these people by having to have them objectively justify all their decisions is basically destroying what we've created, like investing all these years and helping people to hone their sense for what's interesting. But it's just that it's field specific, you know? And so I kind of think that everybody in every field, including people who aren't in a field, have some really well kind of honed instinct for what's interesting in something, because it's what you've spent your life on. You know, I mean, even if you're a homeless, like you've got experience with that, you know what's interesting with respect to that kind of life. And like you're gonna get like, you know, very kind of fine-grained and very sensitive like interestingness detectors out of that. And we should trust you in your own field, like that, you know, kind of what's interesting. Not that, you know, it's not that, so I'm not saying that we should just trust you just because you've had many years in the field. We should still discuss it. Like you should be able to justify your interest to me if I'm one of your colleagues or peers. But we don't have to necessarily ground it out in something objective. We just need to understand, like, why do you think this is interesting? You should be able to articulate it after, you know, if you're like an expert in some area. But in that sense, I think all of us have become much better at knowing what's interesting with respect to where we've sort of invested our lives. And so, like, can it get worse through the education system? So actually, yeah, I think that this is a like a subtle point, actually, that I think like how you learn something affects how it's represented ultimately in your mind, and therefore sort of your flexibility in using that knowledge. And one problem I think I've seen, this is also in sort of AI experiments as well, is that like if you learn something objectively, including if you're an AI, like if you're sort of optimizing along a gradient that's like very strict, then the representation that comes out of that tends to be quite brittle. And this means that, like, although you do know the answer in the very specific situations, you are not very good at moving out of those situations to the adjacent possible, like that's next to those situations, because your representation is very rigidly defined based on your objective experience. This I've seen in AIs. I won't get into all the details, but like what's really fascinating, like if you do like objective-based search and you solve a problem, and then you do novelty search, which is like not objectively based, and it solves the same problem, like the novelty-based version tends to be much more flexible. Like if you, for example, perturb the weights of the neural network or something like that, like it's way less brittle, because it's like the way you lock in knowledge, if you're pursuing interestingness or novelty, is totally different. Like there's a different pattern of stepping stones that you follow, and they tend to be much more broad-based, you know, because if you're following novelty, then you're interested in sort of like broad-based revelations, like, whoa, symmetry, that's kind of cool. Like, I don't know what it leads to, but I like symmetry. It's appealing in some aesthetic sense. Maybe we go farther down here. But the thing is that on the objective track, where you went through stepping stones that are just always about like raising the score, raising the score, raising the score, symmetry never came into it. So you don't have this concept as like part of like your repertoire of concepts. And it doesn't, like, it can't, you don't have these general kind of concepts for this aesthetic senses that build up over time. And so I think like the education system being as it is, very objectively focused, it's all about kind of like hill climbing on scores, on tests and things like that, is creating representations in people's heads that are like really brittle, and only focus in particular one kind of a thing that you can do. Yes, you can solve the problem if you got a good score on the test, but you can't move adjacently very well. And I think that translates also into meaning you don't know what's interesting, because like that's like looking at the adjacent and being able to understand how the adjacent relates to where you are right now and what might be an interesting path to take. And you're not equipped because you followed an objective path, which is why like it's way better if you're going to get to be an expert on something to have followed your own stepping stones. Like if it was driven because it was a personal passion or interest, especially if you were obsessed with it, like you're going to have like way more mental flexibility within that domain that you arrive upon if you arrived it in this non-objective fashion than if you arrived on it through this strict, rigid kind of like hill climbing optimization sense, which is imposed upon us. And you will be like the kind of person who becomes famous for that and creative in that, as opposed to the person who just got there because they're really, really good at following like the kind of rigid objective curriculum that we have in our schools. And this is obviously a problem for all of us, is that we're creating people who aren't going to be like really great at detecting the interesting in their fields. And it's why a lot of the time, like the people who seem like really kind of like virtuoso in their field are like weirdly people who like weren't actually doing well in school or something like that, or like were rebelling against it, and like the teachers were pissed at them because like they followed their own stepping stones and became obsessed in their own right and developed completely different kinds of representations which have aesthetic stepping stones that are related to like recognizing large big picture aspects of how the world works. And so I think that that this is why, another reason why following the interestingness is very important for everybody, even if you find that it didn't lead to a success, because you've developed representations that are really, really different. I remember that there was this guy on the cross country team in high school who could barely run. It was amazing. Like he must have just like his parents told him to join the team, or maybe like he just like was determined to do it. But it was just, I couldn't understand how someone couldn't run at all. Like I've never seen that before. But it reminded me of, you know, like the way I think about like little kids, they don't try to learn how to walk as an objective. You know, you don't sit there like saying, well, everything I do is about like learning how to walk. They're just discovering things open-ended. It's like, wow, I can kick my leg around. That's cool. Like, I don't know where this leads to. It's not they're like, oh, this is going to help me get to walk. It's just like, wow, I just discovered something. Like I could stand up. That's like interesting. That is interesting. Like, I really think that kids' early learning is like open-ended. And this to me is why these behaviors are so insanely flexible. Like the way that walking as a human being is totally different than walking as a robot. But we've also seen that if you do objectively optimize walking, like strictly in a robot, it tends to have a much more brittle gait, again, than something that discovered how to walk through novelty search. And so I kind of imagined that this kid was like really trying to learn how to run in an objective sense. Like that's like the totally wrong way to do it. It's not going to lead to actually getting good at doing something at all. And you get very brittle outcomes from that, which is just totally fascinating, you know, when you think about it, because it's like, that is the procedure for like everything that we do in terms of training ourselves. And so like the tax that it's taking on our ability to be really actually truly good at something, it's just like mind blowing. I just don't know what it means. And it's not even discussed.
All right, so I know people in the audience are just absolutely dying to ask questions. I'm seeing a ton of stuff flashing up in the chat. So if anyone has a question, feel free to click the reactions face at the bottom and click the raise hand thing, and then I can unmute you and go ahead. So Henrik, did you have a question? Are you ready to go? Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of have you expand a little bit more on what you were just talking about. You had somewhere you said that sort of novelty search accumulates complexity, and I wanted to see if you could sort of expand on that idea. Why does sort of novelty search lead to complexity?
Yeah, like I said, this is a subtle issue, and like the reason that I started to understand it or think about it really goes back to machine learning research. But you know, then I kind of like once again bounce back to my general objective critique, like with the sort of like a social critique, but like it really originates with machine learning research and observations that I had there. And so I'll try to navigate the subtlety a little bit without getting like overly technical about it. But like basically one thing that I was observing early on was that like if you discover something, and this is now we're talking about in machine learning algorithms, if you discover something objectively with algorithms, so I had algorithms actually, I should say, that like could increase in complexity over time. I was really interested in these kinds of algorithms. Like one was called the NEAT algorithm, which stood for neuroevolution of augmenting topologies, which would actually like evolve a neural network that gets bigger as it gets better. And because it's getting bigger, that means there's more connections in the neural network, more weights that can be optimized. And so in principle, it can get more complex in the behaviors it can exhibit. And I was always like really fascinated by increasing complexity, like what that can do. And so I was interested in algorithms that do that. And so, but if you take an algorithm like that and you put it within the confines of an objective search, so you take NEAT, this NEAT algorithm, and you say like, you know, learn how to do this task. And then you take the non-objective alternative, which is like a novelty search. And you don't say learn how to do this task because that would be an objective, but instead you say do something novel over and over and over again. But as a side effect of doing something novel over and over and over again, it does actually solve the task, which sometimes happens. I'm not saying, by the way, that you can always solve everything by novelty search, because one of the key principles of novelty search is we don't know what it's going to do. It'll do something interesting, but we don't know what interesting thing. But sometimes it'll solve a problem you actually want to have solved. And then you have this alternative, which is this objectively driven thing that also solved the problem. And what I observed, which is just stark, is that basically as a rule, the objectively driven solution was always 3 times larger than the novelty driven solution. Like in terms of like the size of the neural network, it would have grown to 3 times the size if it was solved as an objective than if it wasn't. And so this is just an empirical fact. Like just observe this, it's a phenomenon. Now, isn't that interesting? Like, why is it always so much bigger when it's done like objectively than when it's not done, when it's done non-objectively? Well, one immediate conclusion that you could draw from this is it's probably a better representation in the novelty-driven version. Now, actually, we could go look at the representation, but before even doing that, it's pretty likely that it is better, because generally more compact is better, right? Like if you can encapsulate a behavior more compactly, it probably means that you haven't memorized it. Like it's not a specifically memorized type of thing. Rather, you've probably discovered something fundamental, like about how it actually works under the hood. And like one of the experiments, like after this realization that we did, like to kind of make it really easy to dig in and actually see the internal representations, was we tried to have it learn to reproduce images, because then you can actually look at the internal representation of these images, and they're also images. So you can like see how it's building those images up internally. And so what we would say is like we would use NEAT to reproduce an image, like get a neural network that would output an image. And then we'd use novelty search, not novelty search, sorry. We would actually we had an alternative system. It's not novelty search, but it is non-objective, where people would actually like search through image space on their own without an objective. And they would just kind of like stumble upon interesting pictures. And so what we're saying was like, let's try to reproduce the pictures that the people found, which is called PicBreeder, which were really amazing pictures. There were things like butterflies and skulls. They actually look like things, with an objective-driven algorithm, which would then try to just reproduce the picture. And once again, as usual, like if it could do it, which it usually couldn't, because like it's usually a lot of the time you can't reproduce things objectively that you can get non-objectively. But if you can, usually with simpler images, maybe you can. Again, 3 times bigger. But then the interesting thing is now we can look under the hood at how the pictures are assembled inside the neural networks that were discovered. And what you find is that it's pure spaghetti in the objective case, even if it solved the problem. This is like a serious problem that I think is like totally missed in the entire field of machine learning right now, is that like simply saying that something works doesn't really mean it's a good thing, because like under the hood, it could be an absolute mess. And so like under the hood, like this thing's outputting a perfectly nice, like say mouth, like we got it made this thing we call the clown mouth, like a smiling. It could reproduce it, but under the hood, it's an absolute spaghetti mess, like, which means sort of like this neuron's responsible for like this little dot over here, and this one's responsible for that dot over there. It's like it's completely a disorganized mess. It has nothing to do with like the principles of like how you form a symmetric mouth. Then you go over and look at the non-objectively discovered version, which is a tiny network, and you find things like this weight in the network will make the mouth like expand and contract in a completely symmetric way, as you would expect. It would one other neuron to make it open and close like an actual mouth would. Like amazing. Like this is absolutely crazy, I thought, because like no one designed these representations. They're implicit representations. They developed through a non-objective search where every step along the way, somebody just found something that because it was interesting. And so it's just absolutely stark. But then, so we have evidence of this, but we might say, why? Why is it spaghetti in the objective case? Why is it so elegant in the non-objective case? Well, actually, now here's where I have to start to speculate, because it's less formal to talk about this, not just an empirical observation. But my belief is that what's going on is that if you're objectively driven, then what you tend to do is you lock in spaghetti, because any random thing that you do that happens to increase your score, locked in. Like, I don't care if it's like interesting, not interesting. Like if I make this pixel light up over here and it causes the score to go up because basically it's one of the like 8,000 pixels I need to light up, then I'll increase the score. I'll lock that in. That gets locked in. So it's like completely random, like what's happening where in the network. It has no organization whatsoever. The non-objective search has a completely different story and narrative, like how it discovered the picture. Because back before you get to the butterfly, somebody saw something symmetric. And they just liked it because it was symmetric, not because they know it's going to lead to a butterfly. They don't know where it's going to lead. They're not trying to get anything in particular. It's just that symmetry is interesting to us. And by the way, it really is. It's like people love symmetric things. So it gets to this question, like what is interesting? Well, it's actually like there's huge complex reasons for different things being interesting at different levels of intelligence. Things like symmetry, they could be innate. I mean, maybe even like going back to evolution, like it's why there's like an instinct for symmetry, but whatever it is, people like it, they find it interesting. They see that it's a branch point to many things. Like maybe instinctually you understand that so many things in the world, both natural and artificial, are symmetric. Just like looking at a car from the front, or looking at a face from the front, looking at a butterfly from the front, like and so forth, like all these symmetric things. So when I see symmetry, it's just like, this is cool. And so now symmetry, as a step along a road to who knows where, nobody knew, it's just interesting, has been locked into the representation. And the variations on that are variations on a symmetric theme. And this happens in a hierarchical way. Then you get something that looks like maybe head-like, and then that thing gets locked in, and so forth and so on. But it happens incrementally in a way we don't know where we're going, but each step of the along the way is interesting, and they're represented on top of each other. So like the things in the future are dependent upon the symmetric representation underneath, and it becomes a beautiful hierarchy. And then you stumble on something that you actually want or care about, and it's represented absolutely beautifully, because it was discovered non-objectively. And so we see this phenomenon for real. Like we have lots of evidence, wrote papers about this because it's so fascinating. Like the non-objective representations are incredible. They're absolutely amazing. Like we looked in the representation of a skull, and it was like literally like a single connection in the network where you can like open and close the mouth. It's like a cartoon character. Like you can actually like take an apple and there's a stem on top, and actually as a shadow, it's like 3D. And you can actually move the stem back and forth with a single weight in the neural network. It's like it detached the stem. It's a modular part of the representation. It makes it wiggle back and forth with the shadow completely plausibly, like as if someone had designed this thing. But it's just an accidental discovery. This would never happen in an objective driven representation. It's like no chance. And so this is like, by the way, this does not apply to like modern like image generation stuff, which is now like the rage. Like that stuff is totally different when I'm talking about, because those are image generators that generate lots of things from a single network. So they may get forced to actually understand some of the underlying stuff. Like I don't want you to get confused and think I'm talking about that stuff. I'm talking about I train a network to output only one image, just one image. And this is what happens. So this one image, it's just like amazing. Like it's like almost like a human designed the underlying representation to match with our intuitive understanding of what are the individual components and how they relate to each other. And so to me, this is like a deep, deep lesson. It's a lesson not just about artificial intelligence and search, but again, about life. Like, because imagine what is happening in our brains when we are objectively driven through our entire life. It's just causing absolute spaghetti, which is probably why you forgot 80% of everything that you ever got a good score on a test on the minute you left college, you know, because like, you just like, your representation is horrible. It can't be extended to anything else. It's like total spaghetti. But the people who like got there on their own through their own passion, it's a totally different path. And this is why it would be good if we could get people to follow these paths on their own and just take their own trajectories. It's a completely different educational system. But like, if you're pursuing math because like it's just really interesting to you, you'll come up with a totally different representation. And that's why most mathematicians actually did do that.
Yeah, I just had a question about something that seems assumed in these discussions of curiosity as a driver of behavior, or like raising free range kids, let's say, is something like the optimality of this curiosity signal as a way to live your life and drive your behavior. I'm just curious what you think about that, and whether you think there's a risk for even a smart person to go down these blind alleys for a lifetime by following interests alone and not actually making any significant progress. And I can imagine a situation where like a programmer is making a tool for themselves or something interesting, where something like a market force, where a metric of will people pay me for this would actually be a positive signal and allow you to make something that you would even find more interesting and useful by virtue of that presence of that signal from someone else, kind of like a metric. So I'm just curious what you think of that optimality, and if you do think it's optimal, what's the basis of that argument? And again, not that I'm on the other side of it, I'm just curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, good question. Like I said a little bit earlier in the conversation, definitely risk is part of the equation. If you're going to follow curiosity, interestingness, and so forth, you are assuming risk, and there's no doubt about that. The problem that we're facing here is that there's a trade-off in life, which is that you can minimize risk, but if you do that, then you won't do anything extraordinary, or you can pursue paths of interestingness, which means you might do something extraordinary, but you're causing risk to go up. So like, there's no way out of the trade-off. Like, if you want to do something extraordinary, you have to take risks. There's absolutely no way out of this. And if you want to change the world, like, you're going to have taken a risk, and there's a good chance of failure. And this is an important caveat to the entire discussion. Like, is that like, if you follow paths of interestingness, you totally could end up like having something bad happen to you. And so like a rational kind of a realistic way to think about this is that like, we need to acknowledge the risk of behaving in this manner and then take that into account in our individual behavior. And so like probably like a middle ground is like the most reasonable take for most people. But like, even before that, I would say it's up to you how much risk you're willing to take in your life. You know, it's just totally reasonable to tolerate whatever level you think is good, as long as you're being honest with yourself. So if you don't want to take any risk at all, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And I would not call that suboptimal. It's your choice. You know, you can go get a degree in accounting. I don't mean to pick on accounting, but it's like, we know that's something you can do. You know, get a degree in finance or something. You'll learn about how to do that. And so you can have a low risk lifestyle. And this is, I think, totally reasonable. Nothing wrong with it at all. It's not suboptimal. It's just an opinion. But like the thing that if you do follow paths of interestingness, you will be exposed to much higher risk. And so like the middle ground I'm talking about is to be a little bit careful, or to kind of to cover your tracks a little bit, so that it doesn't mean disaster in your life, right? I mean, for most people, like there are some rebels out there who they don't give a crap about it. Like, they'll just do the thing they think is cool, and they'll have a giant car crash, and that's the end. But like, most people want a little bit of risk mitigation. And so that means do some things that are objective and like enhance your safety, and make sure, like, for example, if you want to take a lot of risk in research, maybe you should get a job first, like where you can do research. Like, you can start taking those risks when you're like, 18 years old, and like basically just hope that like you do something revolutionary, but nobody wants to hire you. If it doesn't work out, you're screwed. But if you took several years to actually follow a more kind of conventional path, maybe you're a little bit more safe at that point.
Can I ask where you fall on that spectrum? I know it's a personal question,
Um,
so you don't have to answer. I'm just curious.
Yeah. So where I fall on the spectrum, so yeah, there are some areas in my life where I'm like very risk averse.
Mm.
And then there's others where I'm like not risk averse at all. But I think like, well, so for example, medical risk, like I just basically won't risk something physical. Like I'm just afraid of like something happening physical to me or my kids or anything.
Right.
But like research risk is different, you know. So like there, I think I do tend to be more extreme. Like I'll do something that seems crazy. But there's one difference, like, which is that I probably have several of these at once. Like that's my risk mitigation. So like I'll be doing like 5 crazy things at once or something. So it's like one of them probably will work out, you know. It's like at least I'm not like if I only have one thing and all my eggs are in one basket, it's pretty frightening. And I probably wouldn't do that. And so like, you know, at first I'm not a professor at the moment, but I was, and like, that was a good job for that. Cause like, that's basically what you're supposed to do, like to have several projects, you know, like some might not work out, but if some do, it's great. And that's a form of risk mitigation. But I do think that like my personality within the research realm is pretty on the rebel side. Like I'm willing to do something crazy, and like novelty search sounded crazy at first, you know, like I thought it's like, oh, here's an algorithm that doesn't know what it's trying to do. Let's just do that. And so like, you know, you convince students to do that. Like, what does this mean for their career? And, but it turned out to be actually was a good thing to do, because like, it's obviously I'm sitting here in front of you because of doing it. And so, yeah, I think there's components of myself, which is, I think, worth highlighting, since you can do that, you know, you can be compartmentalized. It doesn't mean your whole life has to be crazy. But there can be components that are compartmentalized where you're willing to kind of go off on a limb. There's another part of your question though that I thought was like super interesting, which is this point about like signals that are objective that could influence you. I did want to address that for a second, because that is important. Like you're saying, like market forces or something. Like maybe you find the market forces interesting. Obviously, like there's a kind of conflation that starts happening, like where the line becomes fuzzy between interestingness and objectives at some point. Like, I'm just interested in profit, but it's not my objective. Like, what does it actually mean? But I think like a better interpretation of it is this: if you're interested in, say, whether you call it an interest or an objective, if what you care about is extreme profits, let's say billions of dollars, let's say you personally want to make billions of dollars. That's kind of like an objective. You could even say you're just interested. It's not objective, but either way, it's very ambitious. Well, that's the kind of thing where it won't help you if you pursue it objectively. So it doesn't matter. Like you could be as interested as you want. You could even claim not to be objective, but that interest does not offer a useful signal, because like you can't do things that give you information about that gradient. Like if you, let's say, okay, well, I won't take that volunteer internship because it doesn't get me closer to $1 billion. Like, what does that have to do with anything? It's completely irrelevant to whether you're going to become a billionaire. It might have actually hurt your ability, because the volunteering internship might have actually put you on a path that's interesting that could have led you to making $1 billion. So that signal is not useful actually at that point. But smaller signals, now this is where it gets more interesting, I think, is like, if you already are at a point, like say, I already have a business that's pretty much doing well, and I now actually see that if I make this tweak, it might lead to like a huge revolutionary change in the way that the world works, which could lead me to becoming a billionaire. Now that I think is legitimate, like, because the thing is, you actually are only a stepping stone away, because you already got yourself to the point where you're like one stepping stone away from becoming a billionaire. But the thing is, the road that led you to being one stepping stone away had nothing to do with that interest. It was only at the last step that interest kicked in. But then it is legitimate, because the thing is, things that are one stepping stone away actually are modest now relative.
When you're saying legitimate, what do you mean by that?
Sorry, can you say what I said was legitimate? I don't remember the exact.
You're saying when you decide to do that, when you decide to make that change, which could be revolutionary.
Oh,
and by the way,
see,
I'll stop after this so everybody gets a chance. I just want to follow up on this. But when you're saying it's legitimate, what does that mean? Legitimate in what way?
Yeah. Sorry, that word is unclear. Like what I mean by legitimate is that it's okay to have an objective at that point.
Oh, okay.
Like what I kind of believe is that things that work as objectives tend to be things that are one stepping stone away from where you already are, like situated in your own life. And so like things like, you know, losing weight tend to be one stepping stone away from everyone. I mean, there may be some exceptions because, like, I don't know, someone has a disability or something, but in general, like, you know what the things to do to get to a lower weight are. Like, you could start exercising. And so that's reasonable. And that's what I was calling legitimate. It's a legitimate thing to be objective in that case. So now you're in a special case, though, when you're one stepping stone away from becoming a billionaire. Now, this, because most people aren't in that situation, so to them, it would look like an incredibly ambitious objective. But it's actually not now, because like you got to this point, and the reason you got to that point probably isn't because you had an objective of doing it. But now that you are at that point, you see this thing. And this is actually an important piece of the puzzle of great achievement. So it's not like a throwaway statement that, like, when you're one stepping stone away from something extraordinary, I think that that is actually what most people mistake for being a visionary. Like, when you think of visionaries, like, you think of like these unbelievable geniuses. Usually, like, the archetype, like the legend that we hear, is like this person who like saw way over the horizon, farther than anyone else could see. They saw stepping stones away, like, to this thing that no one else could envision, and then they just like drove that, like, so determined force. Like, it's a very objective story and narrative. But I think that, like, actually the real story is that they were the first person to realize that we're one stepping stone away. It's a totally different thing. It's like Steve Jobs and the iPhone. It's like the pieces were in place, like the iPod was there, like the technology, the mobile technology was there, like it was already there. He didn't invent all that stuff. It was there. And some of it he may have invented, but for other reasons that are orthogonal to iPhones. They were along a path of interestingness. But now we're there. And so the first person to see that we're one stepping stone away often is the one who's recognized as the visionary. And so if you want to be a visionary, don't look 15 stepping stones into the future. Those are false visionaries. And I wouldn't trust people like that. It's the people who actually see that something just snapped into possibility. And that's usually because something changed in the world very recently. And so things like these like image generation technologies that we're starting to see, this is a situation where a number of these kinds of visionaries will suddenly like appear in the world because there's been a technological change whose implications are not understood. And so we're all thinking, well, what's interesting to do now? And I don't know, but there's a lot of interesting things that have obviously been opened up. Somebody's going to see that something like super amazing is just one stepping stone away. And this will cause like something revolutionary to happen. And that's when, you can be objective. And that's what I'm saying. It's legitimate because you just realized that it just snapped into view. And now it's totally achievable and pursuable.
Right. That final point's very insightful. But anyway, a bunch of people had their hands up, so I want to give them a chance.
Yeah, awesome questions. Julio, I think you've been waiting for a long time, so go ahead.
Thank you. So an example of like very ambitious activity are like startups. I see them as a very open-ended search of like the problem states, like what are we solving, and the solution phase, like what are we creating. And you see often successful startup stories have this like stepping stone kind of pattern where, let's say, YouTube started out as a video dating app and then became like a video sharing website, and Uber started out like as a limo service or something. Like you see this kind of exploration done and they reach like the successful kind of stone at the end. But many startups are run in a hyper objective based way where maybe before you do anything, you have a bunch of OKRs and KPIs you present to investors. So how do you run a company with great ambitions in a non-objective based way?
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think that these principles have a lot of applications when you think of startups and venture capital and things like that. Like, where should you invest? What companies should you invest in? How do you do a startup? And that's a field, by the way, where I have found that people in that area are very responsive to these things. Like, people, they want to talk about this. Venture capitalists, I think, are some of the most receptive to these kind of ideas. They're always thinking about how to tell whether something's going to be interesting or good. And so I think that, like, those are great examples, like the dating site leading to like this other thing that isn't about dating. That is opportunism, and it's the ability to pivot. And it's directly related to interestingness. It's like, you think one thing sounds interesting and then you realize there's something else that's more interesting, you just go that direction. And the ability, the mental flexibility to do that, I think, often is present when we see like these wild successes like YouTube or something like that. It was just these people are able to follow paths of interestingness. And this is why I think, and I think VCs could probably say better than me, but I get the impression that some VCs like look for that more than like the specific idea. Like they're kind of looking at the founders from a perspective of, do they have this kind of non-objective capacity? I mean, they wouldn't put it this way, but they have an instinct that like, these are people who are actually able to be opportunistic. And it's like, we're hiring the ability to find this the path through this maze of interestingness that's just inevitably, because of the people, because those type of people, it's inevitably going to hit something really cool. And so I think that is one particular way to look at success in kind of the startup world. I do think that like very objectively driven startups can also be successful, but it's a one stepping stone away principle. Like it's got to be one of those things where somebody realized that there's something one stepping stone away from the start. And then that's like they told their investors, like, nobody's done this, by the way. Don't tell anybody. Like, it's very important we don't tell anybody in a case like this. But like, there's a huge opportunity in the world, probably because something has recently changed. And then we can pursue it objectively, and there won't be a pivot. And so I think that could be legitimate and happen sometimes. And so you're gonna get a mix of both. But like the kind of non-objective version of this, I think is important because it is a kind of success. And I think like it's a dangerous form of success. Again, it assumes risk because we have no guarantee. We don't know where we're even going with something like that. But what I think I would think about it as the initial vision should be a playground. A playground should be a new place to play. You want to create playgrounds, like places where there's tons of opportunity. Like if you're going to be opportunistic, there has to be a new place to explore. And so like some ideas create playgrounds and some create solutions. The ones that create solutions tend to be the one stepping stone away. But the creation of playgrounds, I think, is like equally important in like the ecosystem of creativity. And so like that's not discussed explicitly as much, but like in research, this is true too, that like, you know, we're constantly thinking like, is this algorithm better than that one? But I feel like this discussion misses that like a really, really cool algorithm, it's not better than something. It created a new playground. So like, there's all these things suddenly we could do. It's like, who cares about the metric score? It doesn't even matter. The playground has been opened up. And so if your founders have created a playground and you can see that they're really good opportunists, like they're able to follow the non-objective principle, that could be a good bet, actually. Like they're going to plunder that playground. They're going to find all the interesting things out there. You could just sit back and watch. Now, how to be that person that actually is navigating the playground, that's related to just like being sort of non-objective in general. But I think, yeah, so it gets to this ability to follow the interesting. And that's field specific. Like I said, it has to do with like a lifetime of experience. And so hopefully the playground that you create is a playground that you have the credibility like to really exploit. And that's I think like the way to run things, if that's a sort of vague answer, but like you're in a playground, you have to look at what's interesting that's like within a stepping stone's reach. And you have to have a really good instinct for that. And so it somehow has to match up well with your life's experience. And you also need to get people who similarly will share or at least accept your instinct. So, you know, I look for people on the same wavelength if they're going to get on a journey like that, because it's obviously like risk is constantly going to be like hovering in the air around everybody, and people can't stand that. It's also part of the objective culture. But if there's not an objective way to prove to everybody that you're going in the right direction, then if they aren't on the same wavelength, they're going to be freaked out very quickly and things are going to go south. And so if you're going in a non-objective kind of exploration in a company, which obviously eventually does have to like turn a profit, or at least get sold to somebody, then yeah, things are going to go south. Like people are going to freak out pretty quickly. But the point is that you can do it. I think it's just, and it scares everybody, like in investors too. But like it's another area where I think as a society and culture, we could shift the pendulum a little in the other direction, because it is a totally legitimate way of running things. It just like, it doesn't have the objective security blanket, so it feels scarier. But at the end of the day, it's totally legitimate. The kind of company that I would never want to invest in is one that basically tells me that there's this thing 5 stepping stones away that's going to like completely change the world and rearrange society. But we actually don't know what the stepping stones are yet. But trust us, we're all really smart and we'll get there, because there's just no such thing as being smart enough to know 5 stepping stones away. I don't believe in it. Too much empirical testing of how the world really works has to be done to actually find out how the world really works. And no one can pierce through that with intelligence. It just has to be discovered. And there are things like that. Like think about self-driving cars. Like back in 2017, 5 years ago, tons of investment went into that because lots of people just thought, like, we didn't know how exactly it's going to work, but it has to be just around the corner. We'll just throw geniuses at it. We'll throw money at it. It's going to happen. And I'm not saying it's not going to happen. That's not my point at all. But my point is it's not about to happen. It wasn't about to happen. It hasn't happened. It's been 5 years. And a lot of those labs where hundreds of millions were invested, they've been just completely thrown out the window. They're gone. Because I think the reason is because of the objective paradox. We did not understand that you can't just set ambitious objectives and throw stuff at it and expect it to work, because we don't know what the stepping stones are. And as soon as we make it objective, we're screwing up our ability to achieve it. Probably the route to it is something circuitous. So there's going to be stepping stones that lead to self-driving cars that don't look like self-driving cars. And that's very paradoxical and hard to understand. So it can still happen, but it's going to happen in a way that we didn't expect.
Mm-hmm. That was an excellent question. Justin, I'll unmute you now.
So most of my work is in the homeschooling world in the United States. And there's actually an entire educational philosophy that I think, pretty much coincides directly with the non-objective. And some people call it unschooling, some people call self-directed learning. But there's a big following around, interest-based learning and doubling down on that as the primary form of education, as opposed to something more following a set curriculum. And I think really that is a spectrum, and most people that you actually talk to, we do some things that are on the curriculum, and the other time, most of the time is spent on these non-objective learning pursuits. But one critique I've heard around that is, from more mainstream educators, is that if we assume as one of our precepts, and there's enough research that I think it's reasonable to assume that this is true, that we find things interesting, or in order to find things interesting, we at least have to know a little bit about it. Otherwise, we just kind of filter it out where we're not even curious, because we don't have any pre-existing knowledge to hook on to something new. And so as far as that educational philosophy goes, the goal of filling kids' heads with as many things across a wide spectrum of disciplines is the best way to go at an early stage, in order to allow them later on to find things that are interesting in any different number of things. So I'd kind of be curious about, if you are familiar with self-directed education, anything like that, where along that spectrum you might fall as far as, what objectives should we have, what objectives should we leave as not objective?
Yeah, that really does get down to kind of the nitty-gritty details of like how this can really work with this kind of exploring your own path in an educational setting. I have to admit that I don't know a lot about the educational philosophy behind self-directed education or homeschooling or any of it, regrettably. I have a little experience with homeschooling because of the pandemic. And I know that it was extremely hard, like for the months that we like homeschooled like one of our kids, and it was very stressful. And so like it's that's like maybe why we can't just have everybody just stay home and self-direct themselves. But then that raises the question that you're raising, which is like, well, if self-direction alone was sufficient, then it shouldn't be super hard to do this. Just set people on paths and let them go. But like, obviously there is a need for constraint and guidance. I think, at least. I mean, I don't think you can just have a kid, especially a little kid, just completely on their own, self-directed, and they're going to come out 10 years later, like, fine. I don't think it's going to be fine. And so there's some degree of need for constraint, like to actually impose something. and say that there's some directions we're going to force you down, like, which is what the education system basically does whole cloth right now. And that's like delicate, obviously, that balance, like where do we do that and where do we self-direct? And I'm guessing that you may know more than me, by the way, now, because I'm going into areas where you've actually have experience, but I'm guessing that the answer to that question is basically something that we need to explore to get better at. Because like one thing that's true here is that the degree to which self-direction is viable without a disaster is definitely healthy. Because of what I said about representation, like the way that representation happens in your mind because of discovering things in a self-directed manner is so much higher quality and so much more flexible, that to the degree that we could actually allow you to discover on your own rather than sort of spoon feed it to you, then you'll actually be much better off. But the danger and the problem, that the challenge is that like probably like we can't just let you be self-directed about everything, because like many things will never get absorbed and you'll never go down those paths, and like that's going to be a huge deficit in your life. And so like what we need to do is strike a balance, which is extremely delicate. And that balance, though, I think is worth pursuing, because like we can introduce things into the curriculum. And this applies to homeschool and regular school. I mean, it's not necessarily this is only about homeschooling. This is like about how to guide people. And I think we can introduce things that are like basically rigidly fixed into the curriculum, but they can be jumping off points, right? Like, I mean, they can be, they start with like, let's plant these seeds and get this started, but hopefully we can like get you going on your own down this path, and then you can go down it. And I think that like to the degree we can do that, we need to discover. It's something we should aspire to be able to do that, because it leads to better understanding. But it's delicate, and it's probably also different on different individual basis. And so it doesn't have a one size fits all, like easy, clean answer, but it doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing. And so what that's related to like this issue about institutional kind of objectives and like the way we rate institutions, because like if we're too objective about the way that we think about institutions, like they just have to get good scores on these tests, like it'll totally stop them from exploring this balance. Because they can't afford to see what happens if you let the kids actually just go down paths on their own, because it risks getting bad scores on the tests they're used to evaluate the schools, and then everything's a disaster, and then they're going to lose funding. And so nobody's going to explore this issue. It's not going to happen in the public setting. And so it can happen in of course, the private setting, like homeschooling, but there, then the problem is it might not be scalable, because like a lot of parents just can't put the time in to actually do this, or just don't want to. And so, but whatever setting it is, it's worth exploring to find that balance. And I think it's relatively underexplored, is my guess, even though you may know better than me because you've been sort of like wading into this. But like I think like exploring requires like really getting into something. Like when I say exploring, I mean, we hardcore try to get like a sense of what the balance actually is, what kids are capable of, which kids are capable of what, when, and what is also inevitable, what is not inevitable. Like a big part of open-ended exploration is inevitability. It doesn't get talked about that much, but like some things, like if you restart an open-ended system, like say, like if I restarted evolution from scratch, like on Earth or something, what would be rediscovered the second run? Like, would there be plants? Would there be birds flying in the sky? Like what is inevitable and what is not? And it's interesting that some things are basically inevitable. Like I think of kids as open-ended systems very early, like when they're babies, like in the sense that like they don't have a goal of learning to walk, but they all do. And so that's basically inevitable, even though effectively what they're doing is just following paths of interestingness. Like kids aren't planning out, like, how am I going to learn how to walk? They just like learn it in the process of like checking out different things. So there's inevitable discoveries on the road to like divergent exploration. The longer you let a kid explore, the less inevitable things get. Like you wait 10 years out and it's totally different stuff. Is totally unpredictable what some kid will fall upon and what some kid won't. But a couple years in, like it's like they'll learn how to talk, they'll learn how to walk. Like there's a lot of inevitability in there, even though they don't have any objectives, rigid objectives. And so like the question is to the degree to which like we can rely on inevitability in the education system to allow a certain degree of freedom in individual exploration. And I think that that is just unknown. Like it hasn't really been thought of that way. And it's something we benefit from learning about, because it's how you create like the difference between like the people who are masters in something versus people who just know about it.
Moritz, are you ready?
Hey, yes.
Awesome.
Just a quick comment on the previous point where on like the systematic change. I think we talked about at the very beginning. Brian Kaplan has written a very interesting book about the privatization leading to like a much more efficient education system. So if anybody's interested, really great book. And I'm very curious about your sort of explanation or how you think about the accumulation of human knowledge, where we began as like hunter-gatherers, and at some point we picked up how to make fire, and into today's world, this is a much more, I think, a similar process, but yeah, I think very badly understood. But I think the idea of this open-endedness, and you also mentioned, gathering these stepping stones. Yeah, I'm curious what you think about sort of the accumulation of knowledge in that sense.
Yeah, the accumulation of knowledge, which basically I call civilization, is absolutely, in my view, a canonical open-ended process. In some sense, it shows that open-endedness is possible, that this even happened. You know, because if you think about like open-endedness is basically my field, like within machine learning, that was like my thing, open-endedness. Like if you think about where we see actual open-ended systems in nature and in the real world, there's not many actually. It's a pretty rare phenomenon to see true open-ended exploration. I think there's only really two. One of them is natural evolution, which is a vast open-ended search for more than 1 billion years, which has discovered all the forms of life on Earth, from flying to photosynthesis to the human brain in one run. Absolutely insane, totally open-ended. The other one is civilization. And so it's the only other really true example, thousands of years, going from, like you said, things like wheels and fire to space stations and computers. And there is the explanations for these things are similar, that like what is happening in a system like this is that stepping stones are accumulating. And the important thing about the system is not that it has a goal, and obviously it doesn't, but that it has the ability to accumulate stepping stones. The more stepping stones you have, the more places you can get. Like that's what causes the system to become more interesting the longer it runs. So in evolution, the stepping stones are the organisms themselves. You know, you find something like vertebrates, and then vertebrates leads to all kinds of stuff, eventually humans. And in civilization, it's like you find something like a vacuum tube, and now this is a stepping stone to lots of electrical devices, but actually to computers, because the first computers had vacuum tubes. And now this illustrates an important point, I think, which is why objectivity, or like the pursuit of objectives, is absolutely toxic to civilization. Because like if you think about it, if we had a goal, if we set a civilization-wide goal to build a computer, like before there were computers, let's say before there were vacuum tubes, let's say we go back to the year 1800, or say 1750, before there were any vacuum tubes, and we said, let's have a goal, we'll build a computer. It's kind of similar to like if today we set a goal, like a civilization-wide goal to build a time machine. Might be possible, who the hell knows, is we're not even close. We could say like it's the coolest thing we can do, let's do it. But let's say it was a computer back like 250 years ago or something. Well, guess what? They wouldn't have invented vacuum tubes, because the thing is, everybody would be focused on computers. Why would you be looking at vacuum tubes? There were like more than 100 years of experiments that had nothing to do with computers at all. So we would cut the stepping stone out of the process because we became myopically focused on the objective, and nothing would have happened. We have no vacuum tubes and no computers. So the reason that the system is working, the proliferation of stepping stones, is because it's not unified with an objective. Civilization does not have a unified objective. Individuals might have objectives that are within this gigantic tree of ideas. And some of those are, like I said, totally legitimate the way I put it. Like they're actually fine because they're one stepping stone away after other things suddenly snapped into view. And so like sometimes the objectives worked out. Sometimes they were modest. And other people just followed the pathways of interestingness. This is more often probably the case with revolutionary advances, that they just realized, hey, this could be really interesting to use over here. I'm not even really sure even what it's going to do. Sometimes this is called serendipity. Serendipity is very important to civilization and advancement, but it's also very non-objective because you can't like guarantee you're going to have a serendipity. And so like the overall process is explained by allowing us to accumulate these stepping stones without trying to put this unified, like umbrella imposed kind of objective over the top of the entire process. And to some extent, I think this is continuing today. This is why civilization has not ended. You know, I don't think we're in that depressing of a situation right now. It continues because we continue to proliferate stepping stones. But my concern is that many of our institutions still follow the objective principle. And what's ironic and sort of like pathological is that a lot of these institutions are actually supposed to be fostering innovation. That's where this gets ridiculous. You know, you get to like things like funding agencies who are funding scientific research, and they're entirely objectively driven. And so this is completely like backwards from the way that it should be. And so this has happened over and over again. Labs inside of companies, like what I wanted to focus on here, the education system, totally objectively driven, but needs massive amounts of innovation. All the stepping stones have been completely pruned out of the education system. This is why it's stagnant for the last 30 years, at least in the US. And why every time we come up with a new brand of standardized test, things don't get very much better. It's because like we are actually creating a unified objective system. So there's no civilization anymore. It's no longer like a divergent path of stepping stones where it gets more and more powerful the farther it goes. It's now a unified process where all the possible interesting things have been pruned out. And now we have only one very rigid path of stepping stones heading towards like a dramatic local optimum, which we will never escape. And so this is possible to foster to a greater degree within the niches where it's being, I think, diminished. But the good news is that I think overall, you cannot control all of society. Like we cannot impose an objective on the entire world. And so luckily, there's still divergence happening overall. And there are pockets where it's happening at a healthy clip just because of like the form of like the way certain things work. But I think many things could be working better for sure. And if you look at, for example, like autocratic systems, like societies that are closed, like things that really are objectively driven, like the way, like they don't have much advancement going on. You know, they're top-down control. They're very objective. Like somebody's deciding what we should do. Like that's why we don't see a lot of progress in those kind of societies. And so, yeah, I think like the liberalization of society in the sense of like allowing many kind of flowers to bloom is part of the march of civilization and essential like to continue progress.
Thanks.
Awesome. All right, Henrik, go ahead.
Yeah. First, I wanted to make a comment on the question Justin had and about sort of the trade-off between open-endedness and sort of constraining kids, and that sort of. And I also sort of work in the homeschooling community, and sort of two parameters that you can sort of work with is sort of one is sort of you can delay how soon you add objectives, because then you allow more people to sort of find their way there on sort of open-ended search, and then you sort of catch those that do not, which is sort of close to what you talked about, like catching the things that fail. And the other one is sort of constructing the sort of cultural milieu or the social environment that people around, so they get role models, and that kind of sort of inspires them. So those are sort of two things you can work with. And you can comment on that if you want, but I had a question. Do you want to comment on that before I ask a question?
Oh, that's okay. Those are good points. That's interesting. Thanks. But I'll let you get to your point, your comment.
Yeah. So you were talking about, and you mentioned like shortly in the book, when you're talking about like on the institutional level, like the peer review and how sort of ideas will spread as a sort of an alternative to standardized testing. I want to see if you can so talk about it more sort of general about like how one can go about sort of structuring social networks in a way that sort of fosters innovation, and sort of what we can sort of think about when we're creating these systems to foster innovation and the network topology.
Yeah, and I guess I'll ground it in the educational system, since that's kind of like the guiding topic too. Like maybe just think about the education system, which I basically think of as encompassing teachers. Like think about it as a social network. So there's teachers in different classrooms and different schools and different cities and countries, and they've all got unique problems, some overlapping, some less overlapping, and they all are facing the hope to help these kids learn. And so like we're in that situation. How should we structure the network in a way that actually causes things to progress in a way that's actually healthy for everybody? And so one thing here is that the solution to our problems, and there's many problems in educating kids, is extremely complex and multifaceted, is sort of my assumption. So it's not one stepping stone away, in other words. Like there are a number of stepping stones that we probably have to cross to understand everything that we hope to understand, to really make this work well for everybody. So we're in a complex search space. And so the kids in the classes are facing all these challenges, and the teachers are facing challenges and sort of getting around them. And this will require creativity. We have to try different things. And that means risk suddenly comes up. Like some things won't work. And now we face a very stark problem, right? Because like it's essential that that kids learn. Like nobody should be a victim of the fact that we're trying to be open-ended. Like, oh, well, you know, well, everybody at this school learned nothing during their education, but at least we learned that doesn't work. Like that's not acceptable. This constrains our ability to accept risk. You know, like in some areas, we can accept more risk than others. And so that's part of like sort of just being realistic about all this. Like, you know, for example, like engineering society to be different is quite risky. You know, we can't afford to like explore all the different forms of society. There's some of these could lead in mass death. And so it's just not worth it, even though we might learn something really useful. And education isn't quite at the level of like mass death, but it is true that like we have some constraints on us, and that makes this hard. But I think we are too risk averse at the moment, and I think that like we can't afford to have some failure here. Just because something doesn't work doesn't mean that someone's going to learn nothing for the rest of their entire life. We can try some things. And in fact, we have to if we want improvement, because again, this is a complex search space. And so it requires a degree of open-ended search to actually find what the interesting stepping stones are. Who is going to find those interesting stepping stones? Well, the teachers, they have to be the one. They're the ones actually doing the educating. The teachers, this is interesting because we don't trust them. Well, why don't we trust? How do I know we don't trust them? It's because we have all these standardized tests. Like if we trusted them, they could create their own tests and they could figure out on their own, like how to make sure that the kids learn, but we don't trust them. So you have to make sure like everything has now been sort of like top down organized. Like we know what the curriculum is. We know what everybody should know at what point in time. Everything is in lockstep. And so like the first thing is that the teachers need to have some latitude towards creativity. Try some things. Now, this goes back to what I said about educating somebody for 20, 30 years and then just like giving up on it. Like, obviously the teachers know something about what the problems are. Like, that's like basically what they do for their entire lives. Now, there are separate issues about like whether the teachers themselves are poorly educated or like bad quality or something. That's a separate problem. I mean, we should honor teachers, I think, because they're so important to the advance of civilization. If we don't, we'll get bad teachers. But I'm assuming we have good teachers here. Like if we have teachers who are competent, know what's going on, then we need them to be able to explore. They have to try stuff. That isn't crazy. I mean, teachers know about education. They've been doing it. So like allowing them to try some things, that's okay. We should be able to do that. That means some creativity even. Maybe they try some things that someone else wouldn't do. And we find out actually is a good idea because they thought it was interesting. Maybe it wasn't a good idea. Well, we can move on and not do that anymore. Now we're getting to the network issue. So let's say that some teacher tries something and it does work and it works really well. Like they actually found out that this is kind of interesting. Or there's another thing. Let's say somebody tried something and actually test scores did not improve, but something interesting happened. Like maybe the kids who were doing bad stopped doing bad, but the kids who were doing well no longer were doing as well. Or something interesting. There's some change in the distribution. That's also interesting information. We're learning something. All learning is not always about improving scores. And so like, the issue there is that whenever something interesting happens, will the word get out? Like if it's only that one teacher, nobody else finds out about it. Well, this stepping stone is effectively not a stepping stone. Like no one can actually traverse from that stepping stone other than that single teacher, which is unlikely that they're going to cross all the following paths that might be interesting. What we need to do in order to have an open-ended system is to expose people to the stepping stones. That again, by the way, goes back to civilization. Like the reason civilization works is because we do get exposed to many stepping stones. Like many of the inventions in the world are exposed to us and exposed to us increasingly rapidly, thanks to, for example, the internet, which is a kind of a social network. And that means that things can move more rapidly forward. But it's the exposure of the stepping stones to the people who could actually act on them, which is the important catalyst that allows the entire system to work as an innovative system. So we don't have that at all, interestingly, in the education system. Like the teachers have, it may have, first of all, they're stopped from having interesting ideas because they're inside of this standardized test loop. But even if they had an interesting idea, it's not going to go anywhere because there is no network. There's no exposure to that stepping stone. It'll be just lost, especially if it's only interesting and not raising your score. You know, and there's lots of stuff like that, like things that change in a way that's interesting. Like people are multidimensional. Kids are highly multidimensional. There's many interesting things that can happen other than a score going up. They could be really interesting for people to know about, but none of that stuff will traverse through the social network, even if there was a social network. But problem number one is there isn't. So what should we do? Well, I think we can actually intertwine the issue of having like a minimum of standards with having like ideas percolate through a system. I think we can combine those two things. So problem number one is you're all gonna, like when I say you're all, I'm talking to the administrators out there. You're all gonna freak out because I'm basically saying let teachers do whatever they want just because they think it's interesting. And you're gonna be like, oh my God, like we have no control over anything anymore. Like bad things are gonna happen all over the place. Kids won't learn, like are gonna get bad scores. But the reason you don't have to freak out so much is, look, we can still have some degree of oversight. Like it's not like you can't do anything. Let's do it though in a social network. Like to a large extent, this is how science works. Like in the scientific field, like you try to write a paper and the way it goes is like it goes to a bunch of reviewers. It doesn't go to the entire world. And there's no standard thing that you can do like to review your paper. You don't send it to like some standard committee, which is like knows like whether it was a good paper or not. You send it to like a peer reviewers. It might be 3 or 4 peer reviewers, and they'll write reviews of the paper. What's interesting about the system is not only did you get feedback back from the peer reviewers, but the peer reviewers also learned about your ideas. So the ideas are already spreading through the social network thanks to the peer review system. We could do this with teachers. I mean, basically, it would be a totally different thing, though, because the teacher wouldn't just have some test scores. And if you think about it, the test scores are ridiculous because they reduce this extremely multidimensional thing, like probably thousands of interesting dimensions down to a single score. It's like, this is how well my class did. Like everybody got an average of like 47 on the standardized test. Like none of the other information is out there at all. Like nobody can look at it. No one has any idea what's really going on. Like, so instead, think about it more like a peer review system where the teacher actually documents what they're thinking. It's like, I tried these things. Like, this is why I tried those things. They were interesting because I did this. This was justified because X, Y, Z. Like, it's not a crazy thing to do. Like, maybe it didn't work, but I'll explain to you why and what I did to fix that. Because yeah, ultimately it is my job to get these kids to learn. So if something doesn't work, I can't just continue down that path. I have to actually have these kids learn. So we have minimum standards, like, so that the people aren't just falling off into the deep end. But then, like, I realized like that like I'm actually assembling effectively like a paper or a packet. Like it might include some scores. I'm not saying we don't do any testing ever. Like I'm not saying abolish tests. They're part of the dimensions, like in there, like they're part of our understanding of what's going on. But I try different things and I explain them. Then that will be sent out through a network to some peers, like peer review. Hopefully it's disseminated in a principled way. So it's like, maybe we should try to find teachers that are in situations similar. Like if you're in an inner city school, maybe some of your peer reviewers should be inner city teachers, probably, but not all, because actually sometimes like oblique connections are the most interesting. You know, it's like someone in a different field knows something you don't know and actually turns out to be very relevant to you. So we don't want it to be just only all like sort of siloed in this way, but we should have some degree of similarity and some degree of diversity as we like assemble this network. And then the peer reviewer's job is to basically say, number one, if there's something absolutely horrible, flag it. So that like it can be, maybe if there is some sort of like top-down system, like it can intervene at that point. Like if something horrible is happening, we can intervene. Number two, like just give back feedback. And this isn't to prevent horrible things, but to cause everybody to see more interesting possibilities. It's like, oh, you thought of that, and maybe it didn't quite work how you wanted, but I've done this. And actually, this might actually help with what you were doing. Actually, if you combine those, something like that, that comes back through the network. Now ideas are percolating through the network. And people are exchanging ideas back and forth. And so now, like the other thing that happens is now this teacher here gets the information from the reviewers. So now they're being influenced by the network. And I think like we could set up a network like that. Like it's not even, I haven't even talked about the technical aspect, because like with the internet and actual social networks, like it's, you know, it's conceivable we could do this in a technical manner. So that it's basically set up in a way that's like principled to be like fast, efficient, like makes sense. Diversity is being checked in a way that's systematic. Like we could do these things on purpose if we had the will. Instead of spending whatever billions we spend on the standardized testing industry, we could spend it on this. I'm sure we could set up a network that would be able to facilitate this kind of exchange. And what would happen is ideas would percolate through the system. There would be no universal view. No one would know everything that's going on. Nobody would say like, oh, this is the test level of the country right now. I mean, you could still say it, but it would be irrelevant to the network. It would be just dissemination of ideas through a network percolating around. And if there's big ideas, they'll get big. That's what happens in civilization, right? Like the iPhone came out and everybody has one. And so like, that's going to happen. It's going to happen naturally and organically. We don't need to worry about it. That's how these things work. Things will explode when they're really interesting. They don't have to be good. They could be just interesting, but some of them will also be good. So I think that's what I advocate, think we should be doing. That's how the system should work. The reason it doesn't work though is because we don't trust each other at all. We don't trust teachers to look at each other in a way other than just a score. We don't trust people to say, oh, what's interesting about your idea? Like that's invalid in our view. We need the objective security blanket. We can't do anything without it. We're completely paralyzed because of it. And that's why this educational system is paralyzed and going to be going nowhere.
All right. So I'm curious, Ken, we're coming up to around 2 hours. Do you have time for 1 or 2 more questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah, I'm glad we got to get into some detail. So yeah, I'll take 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, Yulia, go ahead.
Thank you. What I find is sort of hindrance to non-objective based searches, kind of open-ended exploration that are kind of like implicit objectives you still carry over, like a sense of urgency about time and sort of needing to arrive somewhere, even though you've committed to just exploring interesting things. So I wonder, how do you sort of kind of adapt to a new mindset where you can sort of have a sense where you're going on this journey and you might go on different side paths and take your time to explore those, as opposed to the sense of urgency where things need to get done, they need to get done fast, and I need to get somewhere. It's like, I'm sorry, it's a bit rambling, my question. I hope you understand.
No, yeah, I totally understand it. I mean, it's like the challenge that we all face, I think. That like in principle, it sounds good. I'm sure it's like, oh, it's liberating. Let's follow what we find interesting. Like I bet everybody here, if they did that, would eventually find something really interesting. But then we run into reality and we're like, wait a second, like I've got bills to pay. I've got things I have to do. I've got like milestones that I'm supposed to reach. It's, my employer, my school, whatever it is. Like, I can't really do this. Like, this doesn't really make any sense. Or like, even like life milestones, or like, it's like, I need to get a job. I need to get married. It's, I need to get a home. And like, that's going to inhibit you from doing this. Like, this is the free spirit. This is when you're not afraid. Like, people who follow paths of interesting are fearless. And it interacts with the fact that it involves risk. So it's like, it's not the case that the fact that you feel you're in a rush and have to do something is somehow illegitimate. It actually is legitimate. Like, you actually are at risk because of the fact you need to do something. There's real risks involved here. And so like, it's just like, we have to accept that we're constrained in the degree to which we can just like idealistically follow this philosophy. And it depends on your life circumstances. If you're a billionaire and you got nothing to do, like, you can afford to be like this. That's like the ideal case. But like, most people are not in this situation. And by the way, it's not only about money. I mean, it's like even if you're a billionaire and you have like total freedom to do things that are professionally, you still have a family and stuff. Like, everybody's got things they're worried about, And so like, all of us have some degree of constraint on being a complete free spirit. And so like, that has to be acknowledged, that like, it's just like, reality is reality. And so what this offers, I think, is a little bit of release from just like the paranoia that it's reached. I think that's what it's offering. It's not offering something so huge that it's going to like utterly change the way you run your life, but it's basically that like, maybe you're a little bit too worried about all this stuff because like, you've got no channels to just express yourself and be who you are when you follow the interesting. And that is also like a huge mistake, just as it's a huge mistake to forget about all your risks and go crazy. But it's a huge mistake to give yourself no channels to self-expression, because I think of sort of following interestingness as a form of self-expression. And so like, yeah, actually the thing that should release you is the idea that it's actually principled. Because the problem, I think, is that we think of it as not principled. We think of it as like kind of like special time. You know, it's like the time where you just do stuff that's pointless or useless. It's like, you know, the 20% time or something at Google, or something. It's like the time that's not productive. Like we're going to go. But the thing that I'm saying here is like, look, the empirical results support that like actually like those kinds of behaviors are the ones that actually lead to the most amazing things. So you're not unprincipled by doing it. It's just that, yes, it is likely that it won't work. But if you keep doing it, eventually you're more likely to find something that does work, that is really interesting. And work doesn't necessarily mean you make $1 billion. It might mean you just do something very satisfying to yourself personally. Like who knows what you're going to discover. But like it is the only way that you're going to have those kinds of experiences is to take a little bit of risk. And so like you got to make some room for risk, and it depends on your personal situation and the room you have for risk. And it's true that like people who are living in dire circumstances can't afford to do this. You know, just to accept that. Like if it's a life and death every day, and you're starving, like, you know, you can't afford to just be like, well, I wonder if I walk down this path where I'll be. Like, it's just like no time for that. So like the best thing to do if you really, really want to live a life like this is put yourself in a position where you have less risk. Like get in a position where you're somewhat comfortable and can take some risks. And obviously that's easier said than done. But there are certain jobs that support, like I said, like becoming a professor for me, like it definitely helped mitigate research risk. And so you kind of, part of the job is to take some risks with research. Like even though you'll find that like there's lots of professors who don't want to take research risk, because they're afraid, like they're measured on metrics too. They have like publication metrics, like the whole world is ridiculously objective. So I'm not saying like you'll just go to find some like, you know, there's not just some dream job where everything's protected and you don't have to worry. No matter where you'll go, you'll face this problem. But there are some places where it's less than others is the point. And like, you got to find that path. If you really want to get like free and liberated, then like you got to find a place where you have like some room for risk in the area you're interested in. Other areas, you don't have to take risks. Just take them in the areas where you're interested in. And then even though you will always face risk, you know, give yourself like a little bit of room to do it because it's not so bad. Like, you know, the other areas of your life aren't going to all fall apart. And it is principled and you're justified in doing it because it is principled. So it's worth doing. That's how anything interesting is going to happen.
I have a
go ahead.
related question on education system, sort of the economics of it, where I wonder, like, I think right now we have this like very state funded model. And I think like personally, ideally, I think we have something very market driven, although I'm also not 100% sure if that's the most optimal, because then I think everything is optimized for like the value an employee can generate at the end of the day. But I would be interested how we can measure these open-ended potential education system, sort of the ideal system. How could we measure and allocate the resources based on which one works the best?
Yeah, I'm also not sure, like it just easily solved by like going to a private system or something.
Right.
Like the health system in the US is like, you know, semi-private and has all kinds of problems. And so it's very complex. And so like the question of, how to allocate the resources how would you phrase your question? Just to make sure I'm on the right track.
How to measure an effective open-ended education system.
I see. Yeah, thanks. So this gets to a paradox because like everything I'm saying is anti-measurement, you know, like measurements go hand in hand with objectives. Like as soon as you have a measurement, you have an objective, or as soon as you have an objective, usually a measurement is following. How do I know I'm going towards my objective? I'll measure it. Great. This is what leads us astray, because the problem is it's very hard to measure whether you're moving towards a complex objective. We don't actually know what to measure. Like, how would you measure whether you're getting closer to developing a computer in the year 1600? It's like, there's nothing to measure. Like you need vacuum tubes, but like that won't make the measure go up at all because it's nothing to do with compute as far as we can see. So you can't measure things like in this kind of a non-objective system, like a system where like you don't know what the stepping stones are and you're far away. And so like one of the most paradoxical problems of all is to say to measure open-endedness itself. Because it's like you're talking about things that are almost the opposite of each other, but yet it comes up over and over. So it's worth addressing, because actually like in the field of open-endedness within machine learning, and also it's in the field of art, there's another field called artificial life, where also people care a lot about open-endedness. It comes up over and over again. Everybody wants to know how to measure it. And measurement is also tied to definition. So like you can't measure something if you can't define it. So like there's endless argument about what is the definition of open-endedness so that we can measure it. What is the measure like to tell us whether it's a good open-ended system, not a good open-ended system? Like there's been proposed measures. I'm not saying you could apply these in life, but for some artificial systems, like for example, there's something called activity statistics. It was proposed by Mark Bedau, and it was like an attempt to measure open-endedness. I would say that like no measure yet is fully satisfying. Actually, I would go as far as saying no measure yet is at all satisfying. Like there's no good measures yet from a formal kind of machine learning perspective. It's just really hard to say that something is, just generally speaking, is open-ended. One of the problems is that like it's ultimately, I think, subjective whether you're satisfied with an open-ended system, because you have to at the end of the day decide what you find interesting. And we're back to that again now. Like what do we find interesting? Like was evolution successfully open-ended? Well, I think it's extremely successful, like evolution in nature. Like it's just super interesting, but that's just my opinion. I mean, I can't prove to you, like you could easily make an argument where you say like everything that happened since the very first cell is of no consequence whatsoever in the grand scheme of reality. Like, what does it matter? The universe is going to end. Like a bunch of stuff happened. It's all going to go back to just vapor and then it'll be over. I don't believe that at all, but that's my opinion. I don't think this is based on fact. This is just, I feel that this is a very interesting phenomenon that's going on. Most people would agree, I think, but it's not because it can be formalized, I don't think. And so this leaves us, I think, with a real quandary, like when it comes to measuring the success of the open-ended system. And I think that what I think we need to actually ultimately get away from the idea that it can be measured and move towards the idea that it can be discussed at this level. Very uncomfortable ground, probably. A discussion without a measure, like what are we doing here? We're all going crazy. But I think that we have to do this, like when it comes to innovation, because there's no final grounding and no final arbiter about whether something is moving in a good direction from an open-ended or innovative perspective before you've seen the result. And we can all, obviously congratulate ourselves when everybody is scoring 100 on their tests. At that point, it's over. Like then we'll be happy. But like when it isn't there, like how do we know whether things are working? Well, if you start saying, well, I need to know that we're moving towards everybody getting 100 on our test, we're back to having an objective system. Very slippery ground to be able to do this. Now, I think we can have local measurement. Like that is possible. There's a whole field called quality diversity, which basically causes local competitions that actually are objectively measured, but globally, there's no competition. So there's no global metric that's like a supervening the whole thing. You can have some of that and not destroy the process. So there can be some sort of like objective measurement going on. Like for example, test scores can be part of something. But like globally speaking, I don't think you can have a full objective measure. You can have things that are sort of measures of like how diverse the system is. But again, it's going to be subjective at some level. Like what is diversity based on? It's based on a measure of novelty. And then we're back to that again. Like what do we think is important? But I would say ultimately, like do some measurements like that, come up with some diversity metrics. Like it's okay. It'll be subjective to some extent, but we can still do some measurement if we agree, if we have some consensus about this. But we're going to have to discuss it, like ultimately, like we're going to have to engage with the unpleasant, like nasty aspect of reality, which is that it's complex. And like the funny thing is, like, of course it's complex. Like that's why it's such a problem to us. Like this isn't like there's no way around the fact it's going to be messy to actually like engage with this. And like the way I think of objectives is like just an excuse to not engage with the complexity of the system. Like objectives are basically an excuse to just dump all of your knowledge and experience out the window. Just look at a graph and decide like it's good or not. And it's basically just excusing you for like basically having no knowledge whatsoever, to have no knowledge whatsoever. Yeah, go get your PhD, like spend 30 years like learning about some field. And then at the end of the day, we don't care what you actually think about something. It's just only whether the graph is going up. And this happens, like this is the way, like in the review systems of papers, like it often works that way. You'll get highly educated people who are supposed experts in a field, and they'll dismiss an entire paper just because, hey, you didn't compare it to method Y. I don't know if your method's better. I don't have to engage with your ideas, talk about whether they're interesting. Doesn't matter. I can just say, you haven't compared to this. That's an objective measure. Come back when you do. and we haven't even engaged with the material at all. At some level, at the level of education as a whole across the entire world, we're gonna have to engage at some point. Like the reason there's no progress is there's no engagement. And that means discussing what's interesting, like what is actually matters to us. What do we think are the paths that matter? And I submit that like if really experienced, highly qualified people who know about the field get into a sincere discussion with each other, where they're being honest about like trying to actually talk about this rather than just shut each other down, we might actually make some progress. Like we actually could say whether we're happy with how things are going and whether this open-ended system as a whole is a system of value.
Maybe one way out of the progress is not to phrase the question as how to measure an effective open-ended education system, but how to, or what makes that system interesting, or discuss the, I don't know, is there some like conclusion we can draw on how to resolve the paradox?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good move. Yeah, like if we can talk about what makes the problem interesting, or maybe we could say what makes this system healthy or something, like it's education. Like things are like ideas are moving around in a healthy way. This looks good. Oh yeah, I think we can discuss that. Like we should be able to discuss that. Like also like how can we tell? Like are things moving around? Like what is, can we have a view of the network? Like there's a global network here. Like who peer reviewed whom? Like there is some way to see this. Like there's too many to view it all at once with your eyes, for example. So maybe we can analyze in other ways, like whether there's a good distribution of ideas moving back and forth. We can look at like anecdotal examples like throughout the network. Like are all the good ideas in one corner of this, and like is everything else is stagnant from the point of view of the participants? Like there are different things we could ask, and that's worth discussing. I think it gets into the minutia, but it's worth discussing.
Awesome. Do we have time for one more? I know Justin's been sitting there waiting.
All right, yeah, let's do the last. This could be the last question.
Yeah, this is absolutely last question. Go ahead, Justin.
Okay.
Yeah, and not so much a question, just to go off of what Moritz was saying, and maybe an observation to tag onto that. You talked about the system as, maybe there should be some minimum criteria that's set, and then space for open-endedness on top of that. And so maybe those minimum criteria, and those are the things that you kind of centrally set. So those are the things you have set measurements for. Those are some things we actually could measure, and then everything on top of that, the open-endedness, maybe that's something that is more of a decentralized system. We don't really measure it, we more observe it, and then see that through different market forces which way people are gravitating. There's other feedback mechanisms that people are looking for on the individual level, like, does my kid like to go to school? Am I fighting them every day to get out the door, or are they like, hey, this is awesome, I'm going to go learn about this? Those are the things you won't really be able to centrally measure, but you can observe the way that people are reacting to the system. Maybe in a more open-ended system like that. So if we find some sort of combination between a measurement and an observational of the decentralized system that's on top of that.
I totally agree with that. I think the minimal criterion is very important, both because like it is true that we need to have some minimum standard. Like we don't want something to collapse. This is not a case where we can afford that risk. Like people need to learn, but also because it does pacify all these objective obsessed people who can't stand not having something objective to look at. It's like, well, we do have, at least we have this score, but the trick is, there's a trick though going on there, which is that like, it's not a measure of progress. You see, what those people really want is a measure of progress. They want to see a gradient where you're going up. Minimal criterions don't go up. They just stay minimal. Like you're not trying to find out if things are improving through the minimal criterion. You're just trying to make sure that things don't collapse into a level that's unacceptable. So it's a floor. It's not a gradient. And this is a very, I think, unintuitive or counterintuitive concept for most people who are used to like modern assessment. I don't think in terms of minimal criteria, like that is uncomfortable, but because they want to actually have a gradient to follow, like that's what measurement is for. But they won't really be able to tell the difference because they don't even really understand why they're doing what they're doing or what the toxic effects are. So I think to some extent, it'll make people feel a little better that there's a minimal criterion. I mean, obviously, like in this fantasy, like this is like absolutely revolutionary if we really reorganize the education system in this way. I'm not delusional this is going to happen anytime soon. But if we did, like, yeah, there would be minimal criteria. I think it's important for the system, and it's also going to make people feel a little better that there's some objectivity going on. And so that's totally right. And then that I think works hand in hand with like what you said about like whether the kind of open-endedness is working at an interestingness level, whether we like what's happening locally and to some extent globally, like what people are saying. You got to look at all the dimensions. It's very multidimensional, but that will lead to a kind of a minimal criterion search, which actually is a name for things. Like we had algorithms like minimal criterion novelty search, like in AI that like use this idea. I was for a long time fascinated with minimal criteria from an algorithmic perspective, because it sort of creates this floor that you could never crash through, and then everything else is sort of open. It's actually pretty interesting. So it's actually a principled thing to have a minimal criterion search. And I think it's conceivable. Whether it will happen, I don't know, but it's certainly conceivable to construct the system that way, and it probably is the right version of the system, like for like really finding cool stuff. And by the way, like if this was the system, like I think education would be just way more pleasurable for everyone. Like you said, do my kids want to go to school? Can I get my kids out the door? Kids are going to much more like a system where things are being tailored to them. Interesting things are being tried. Everything's not the same every year. Everything's not regimented into standardized tests. You're not considered a complete failure if like you don't get the score you want. The school isn't considered a failure. Like the world will open up. It would be so much more pleasurable. Like people will be pursuing things because they're actually interesting. Like that will be encouraged sometimes. Like it would be a beautiful world, I think, for everybody involved.
Awesome. Ken, we're so grateful for you giving up your time to speak with us today. It was a lot of fun. We don't get an opportunity to do this very often. So thank you so much. And I'm really grateful to Henrik for helping organize this and arranging the event. And to everyone for their excellent questions. I mean, pretty much like every single question led to an amazing, interesting discussion with so much stuff to think about later. And I know I'll be loading up the video once it's up on YouTube to go back and take notes on some of the sections. So I'm just really grateful. Ken, is there anywhere like we should go online to follow you, or any social media stuff? How can we help get the message out about the power of non-objective search and so on?
Yeah, well, I should also just echo what you said. I mean, thank you, and the questions were great, and I really appreciated the long form of this, like to be able to get into depth. I mean, it took a couple hours, but it allowed us to really get into depth, and it was nice to get these thoughts out because I haven't had the opportunity. So thank you for setting that up and for people asking these like really probing questions. So in terms of following me, you can go to, like I put up a website recently, kenstanley.net. If you want to find like contact info, I have a Twitter. You can find it there. That's also there. It's Kenneth Zero Stanley, basically, on Twitter. That also, by the way, like I'm going to start a company that's going to try to deal with some of this stuff. Maybe worth mentioning that. Nobody knows about it yet. Haven't really mentioned it in much, and it's not even named. But that's something you could follow going forward. Sort of try to increase serendipity in general. That's what the company will do.
Oh man, it's
very exciting.
Is there any like hint as to what the company is going to be doing, or is that kind of open to be discovered?
We're going to try to create a system that's basically like a serendipity network, where serendipity will be maximized in the system. But I guess I'll leave it at that.
Oh man, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, well, hopefully we can have you back at some point to maybe once the company is launched or something like that to discuss it and see how it's going.
That'd be great. Yeah, I love that.
Amazing. All right, well, thank you guys for coming out. I guess I'll end it here. Yeah, see you all next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was fun. See you guys.